Hey, welcome to this week's every other week episode of I Was Just Thinking. I'm Rudy Max. I'm a travel journalist and broadcaster. And if you're a regular viewer, you know that we do this every Thursday about 2 o'clock Central, my time, 3 o'clock Eastern, noon in Pacific. And the topic is always travel because I'm a travel journalist. And one of the great delights of doing this webcast is reading books that I might put off reading or forget about at some point, and discovering, new authors and new writers that just thrill me. And that is exactly the case today. My guest today has written a book called My Place at the Table. Alec Lobrano is the author. He's American by birth, but he's lived in Paris for decades now. And he's a guy who was sent to Paris. Alec, welcome to the show. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much, Rudy. Pleasure.
Alec was sent to Paris decades ago by Women's Wear Daily, which publishes a daily trade publication that I used to subscribe to at the Washington Post when I was a reporter, and now publishes W Magazine, I presume, still. And he was sent to be a men's fashion writer. Alec knew nothing about being men's fashion writer, and the Mr. Fairchild, who owned Fairchild Publications, who said, "That's okay, Alec. If you do a bad job, I'll just fire you." Alec apparently did a good enough job to hang on for a couple of years. And what he found was that he had a deep and abiding interest in food and cooking. And he was in the right country for that, obviously. And he began writing some freelance pieces for publications in Paris and in the United States. He eventually became the Paris editor for Gourmet magazine. You may remember we had Ruth Reichel on this webcast a couple of months ago in honor of her book. She was the editor of Gourmet and had a dinner at the Four Seasons in New York with Alec and was impressed by him and hired him. He also wrote frequently for Bill Sertle over at Travel and Leisure. Travel and Leisure or Food and Wine, Alec?
I worked for Bill at Travel and Leisure, and then I worked for him at Saveur, and then we worked together for a long time at Gourmet because he was the travel editor there.
I remember Saveur. And then came, in the last couple of weeks, My Place at the Table. And I will tell you, because I can say it, because he may be a food critic, but I've written a few book reviews in my life, has written a fabulous book about food. And if you're watching this show and you're interested in travel and food, you may think that writing about food and restaurants is easy. I always thought that. I sat next to food critic named Phyllis Richmond for years at the Washington Post, and Donald Dresden before that. And I've known a bunch of food writers. And I thought, what a great job. They just go out and eat for free. Well, they don't eat for free. They usually pay it, certainly at publications. What a great job. Just go out and have dinner all the time. If you don't like it, okay. Sometimes we have meals we don't like, but you get to eat all this food. You go out every night. Try writing a restaurant review without saying, well, the food was really delicious. Yeah, it was really a scrumptious souffle. That steak was great, pink, right? Just exactly the way I like it in the middle. Try writing a food review that evokes a place, a feeling, even a taste. Alec Lobrano's done it, and it's a great delight to have him on the show. Alec, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
So I thoroughly enjoyed your book, as I told you when we talked earlier about you coming on in the webcast. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's also your personal story of you growing up. Why don't we start in the beginning part? What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up? And what was your relationship to food in those days?
Well, I grew up in Westport, Connecticut, which is about 60 miles north of New York City. And I had a very bipolar food background as a child, actually, Rudy, because my late mother was from Boston, my father's family was from New Orleans. So I'll let you guess which part of the family gifted me with a gastronomic aptitude or interest.
Right.
With all due respect to Boston, today there's some excellent restaurants up there. But I was, from a very, 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 very early age, fascinated by food and not fancy food. I mean, for example, I still think, we all have benchmarks of things we've eaten in our lives that we don't forget. Westport had an astonishingly good Chinese restaurant. I mean, really a world-class Chinese restaurant. And what did we know about world-class Chinese food? Well, we had it. But we also, even in the elementary school, because in those days, the school menus were published in the local newspaper, and they cooked from scratch. And the ladies in the kitchen were Italian, Polish, whatever grandmothers, and they cooked from scratch, and their food was unbelievably delicious. So when people in Europe say to me, Americans know nothing about food. I say we know everything about food because as Americans, we play a whole keyboard of different kitchens, tastes, and products. Because anybody, depending on what part of the country you're from, you've eaten Korean food, you've eaten this, you've eaten that. It's a reflection. It's a reflection of the diversity for me that makes America such a great country.
But your parents weren't particularly talented cooks. It wasn't like you cooked with your mother in the kitchen or father, and
no. To her eternal credit, my mother saw food as a vector for encouraging our curiosity about the world. She was a family circle, and she cut out recipes, but I mean they were open 1 can of LaChoy water chestnuts, 1 can of and dump it all in a pot with some hamburger and stir. And it actually ended up tasting pretty good. And she was also a brilliant, busy lady with 4 kids, who always felt slightly indifferent about being a housewife. And yet she did gift her 4 children, because I'm the eldest of 4. I have 2 brothers and a sister. We all love food. We all cook. We travel to eat. And the first time I came to Europe, I wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago. My mother inherited some money from a forgotten great aunt she didn't know she had, and looked at us wide-eyed and said, "You know what? I'm going to spend this. You're not ever supposed to spend inherited money, but I am. I'm taking you all to Europe this summer, and we're going to do it the right way." She was an art historian, so the theme of the trip was the Roman Empire, because she had 3 adolescent boys. We landed in Rome, and we flew home from Ayr in Scotland after we saw Hadrian's Wall. It was a fantastic trip. But my interest, and it was the subcurrent of the entire trip, was I cared more about the spaghetti carbonara than I did about Caravaggio. It wasn't that I was indifferent to Caravaggio, but the food was so spectacular, whether it was everything in Italy, and then we went to Austria and had an amazing meal at the Hotel Sacher, real Wiener Schnitzel, where that was like the veal cutlets were inside of pillowcases of crunchy crumb, souffle Rothschild, which we ordered because my mother said, we have to find out what this could possibly be. It couldn't be bad if it's called souffle Rothschild. Well, that was a bit disappointing. It was like a baked Alaska with fruit cut at the bottom of it and a little bit of gold leaf on the top of it. But anyway, I could go on about that forever. I was gifted. I mean, my gastronomic curiosity was very, very much honed and put on the rails by my parents and by my grandmothers. So I was quite lucky in that way.
Yeah, your father did not particularly. He wanted you. In fact, I don't know where you were in. I don't know, 4th or 5th grade, and your assignment for the class was to write about your favorite thing. You had to write it right there on the spot, and you wrote about your favorite BLT.
And my favorite sandwich, which is BLT.
Right.
I was sitting in this 2nd grade. I'm sitting in the front of the class, and the teacher said, and she looked at me and she said, "You can't write about books, Alec. You always got your nose in a book." And I thought, well, I could write about my dog, but that's pretty obvious. I could write about the apple tree that I climb up in. And then I thought, no, what I really want to write about is a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, because it's such a perfect sandwich with the salt and the porcine richness of the meat and the juice of the tomato and the mayonnaise slicking it all together. And so I did, and she loved it. My mother loved it, and I got an A on the whole thing. And when my father came back from he worked in New York and commuted, my mother, was excited to show him the paper, and he glanced at it and dropped it in the litter bin and said, "I mean, really, truly, writing a paper about a sandwich? I sometimes think I should put suction cups on your head and tell you to put a bent paper clip in an electrical outlet."
Right. And you don't still have a copy of that essay on the BLT, do you?
I do have the
really.
When my mom finally, in her later years, when she sorted everything else and sold where we grew up, she sent us all a big bundle of papers and birth certificates and all that stuff. I mean, she's a very organized lady. And yes, that yellowed almost falling apart piece of ruled paper from Greens Farms Elementary School in Westport, Connecticut was among the papers that was
That
inside.
is great. That is great. Well, I want to tell our viewers that we're going to be talking about some of your favorite French restaurants and the state of French cooking today. You live in Paris. We're reaching you today at your home in Paris, correct?
Actually, right tonight, I'm in the south of France tonight because since COVID, we've been going back and forth between Paris, and we have a house between Uzès and Nîmes in the south of France. And at this time of the year, it's pretty nice to be down here. The markets are beautiful. France just today opened up fully to Americans again, which is fantastic. So we're having a conversation about France on the perfect evening, actually, I think, Rudy. So I go back and forth. I was in Paris last week, and the city was jubilant when the restaurants reopened because they're such a profound part of the life of the city. We'd miss them desperately. We miss the food. I think we're so sick of cooking, we could, slit our wrists. I liked to cook, I thought, until I had to cook nonstop for a year and a half. But it wasn't just the food. It was the fact that I see restaurants are like little theaters, and the conviviality and the sociability and the way that they are like a snapshot of a neighborhood, a snapshot of the city, and they tell you where you are. And I'm as fascinated by them from a sociological point of view or a theatrical point of view as I am almost as I am by a gastronomic point of view. Food comes first, of course. But Paris lives so profoundly in its restaurants, and without them, the city was rudderless.
No question. I'm so delighted to hear that because we've been checking in with folks in Paris over the time. I wanted to read something. I have a lot of things to read, actually, to give you an idea of how Alec writes. Let me see. I took pictures of them. I finished the book last night. This is a meal you had. I don't know where you were. I don't know where you were. You'll know after I read it to you. But this is Alec writing about a particular dinner. He said, the main courses my friend John and I had that night. Oh my gosh, my page just disappeared. Sorry. I'm sorry. I have so many pages photographed and I came across this one. Here we go. Okay. The main courses my friend John and I had that night also showed off the intriguingly earthy but improbably refined style of the Brittany-born chef. Boned roasted pigeon was stuffed with foie gras and came with a side of wilted cabbage to offer a whole jazzman's keyboard of suave bass notes in the same dish, while the chaste sensuality of a thick-crusted slice of pan-roasted cod was awakened by a brightly herbaceous vinegar-spiked salsa verde. This vivid green condiment told me Breton had renounced the dairy-rich French sauces he'd learned to make during his haute cuisine apprenticeships. Instead, he was looking to dress up the plainness of his region's traditional cooking with fresh herbs, reduced stocks, and umami-rich garnishes that often came from beyond the borders of France. That's beautiful writing.
Thank you very much, Rudy.
And I mean, with us to offer a whole Jasmine's keyboard of suave bass notes in the same dish. I mean, who comes up with lines like, well, Alec Lobrano does. And I've got some other examples you'll hear during the time. But he was also you once described a veal stew in a sauce that was, I quote, as soft and soothing as a baby's blanket. That's good writing, Alec. I mean, I tell you, there aren't many food writers.
Thank you very much. That was just the Bronchette de veau or veal stew that my landlady, I mean, one of my many tutors.
Let's talk about your landlady. So you go to Paris and you luck into a pretty good apartment, and there's a landlady there who really awakens your appreciation for cooking and gives you, I think, a broader.
That's what we had in common. And there was I describe it in the book, as you know, I lived on the ground floor and they lived upstairs over me. And the couple was a French countess and her retired British diplomat husband. And one morning, the Spanish concierge in the building knocked on the door and said, they would like you to come for Sunday lunch. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, God, I can't imagine anything I'd rather do less than that. They'll be stuffy and it will be, it'll just go on forever. And why do they want me to come upstairs? I mean, I'm their tenant. Isn't that enough? but I thought I had no choice but to go at least once. So I did. And Madame Keys, the Countess, had grown up in Morocco. Her father was a line of long French, prominent French military family. And she talked endlessly about food. She asked me questions about food that I'd never thought of before, and asked me about when I said to her that I had to relearn to eat since I'd moved to France, because there were so many different choices and people were constantly asking me questions that I couldn't answer. When I was living in New York City in a studio before I moved, I knew 3 kinds of potatoes. There were Maine potatoes for like boiling, red potatoes for potato salad, and Idahos for baking. And I didn't give it much thought, frankly. There, when I went to buy potatoes, there were 20 different kinds of potatoes. And, the sellers saying, what exactly? And I said, a roast chicken. Well, where's the chicken from? And what are you going to stuff it? And I'm thinking, does this really make that much difference? Well, yes, it does. That's what I learned. So Madame Keys and I talked about that, and she gave me the phrase that was a compass that I used to go forward in my culinary writing career. And she said, Alexander, you have 2 things. You have to remain humble, and you have to try to decipher the intentions of the chef, which was a runic phrase that meant nothing to me for a long time, until the day that I actually thought that was one of the most brilliant things anyone's ever said to me. She was absolutely right.
She taught you a couple. Well, what the other quote she gave you, the Contessa said was, and I quote her, you quoting her, "Great food is when things taste of what they are. Above all, keep it simple. Never forget either of these dictums because they're essential and eternal." And she also taught you that the proper way to eat asparagus was by picking it up with your fingers, dipping it gently in the hollandaise sauce, and then eating it, not with a knife and fork.
I've never, no, not a knife and fork. And this was something else. This was part of the very steep, and sometimes, honestly, a bit arduous learning curve when I first got here, because, when you exchange a fantasy for the real McCoy, it's never going to line up with what you thought it might be. What I was not thinking, I spoke very bad high school French when I got to Paris. What I didn't foresee was that I'd have to learn a whole new set of manners, that there were endless right and wrong ways of doing things. And I was constantly being corrected for doing them the wrong way. And, at that table, I learned a great deal. When I think of them now, I think of them with enormous affection, and still sort of wonderment, my thinking, what possessed them to, they fought like cats and dogs, so maybe my presence was to enforce a truce. I have no
right, exactly. They were being polite in front of the guests.
Right.
Well, she tutored you, well, in a sense, tutored you for, I think, a couple of years, right? You said she taught me about French cooking over the course of 24 or so politely didactic lunches spanning the 2 years I was her tenant. I like politely didactic lunches. So when you had lunch, you talked food.
We did talk food, and when she was a very interesting woman. She was a very, very fascinating woman. And when she said one day about that veal stew that we were talking about a minute ago, one of the most famous French bistro dishes, Bronchette de veau, which is veal in a cream sauce with mushrooms and onions. And she'd made it. I tasted, first time I ever tasted it, I thought, there's something about this that is unlike any other version of this that I've ever tasted. There's a little brightness in the sauce, and I can't quite figure out what it's coming from. And I said to her, there's something about this, I can't quite find it, but I don't know what you did, but it's just a teeny bit off center from the traditional version. And she was elated, and she said, I grew up in Morocco. Pickled lemons are one of my favorite foods, she said, because she was left alone as a little girl with the Moroccan nursemaid, Moroccan cook. And she said, if you use just a teeny bit of pickled lemon in the blanquette de veau, it wakes up the sauce. And she's absolutely right. And it was and even actually, really, even having conversations like I'd never had conversations like that before. I mean, at our dinner table, we sat down. My father liked things occasionally that one didn't eat very often in the Northeast in those days, like artichokes from Louisiana. We tasted things and said, "Oh, this is nice," and then the conversation continued. Period. There was never any conversation about trying to uh, deconstruct or further
The meal in front of you, right?
nuance or anything like that.
Right. Well, you went on to then you started writing a few things about restaurants and profiled a few chefs and so on, and you eventually left Women's Wear Daily and started the hard life as a freelancer. Had to move away from the Comtesse's building.
Apartment, yes.
And one thing led you started writing for Time Out when it began in Paris, Time Out magazine. I was particularly intrigued by your profile of Paul Bocuse later in your career, and I'm in my dining room here. I wish I had a wide angle lens, but I have a lot of menus framed from it. I think you may recognize that yellow cover there. That's the first time I ever ate at his restaurant outside of Lyon.
Right.
Signed by him. That's his menu there. It's all in francs, of course. It was long before euros. But anyway, that's Paul up there in that yellow frame. The thing that struck me about that restaurant, and you didn't mention it, Alex, I thought you might, was he had his logo on everything, including the pads of butters. Everything was PB. This PB bread. I mean, everything was PB. The guy was a marketer.
He was very much of a marketer, and that's why he sent his son to the U.S. to be the chef at the French restaurant in Orlando. When Disney first opened in Orlando, Bocuse's son was sent across the Atlantic. Bocuse loved the United States. He had had a blood transfusion as a young man, and the plasma at that time, the plasma was in short supply in France, came from an American military hospital. So he used to love to say, I don't know whether he said this to you, but he said it every time to most Americans. Well, I am American because my blood is American blood.
Full-blooded American, right?
I found him. I mean, his, when I talked about that day, there I was. There was a metro strike that day in Lyon. So there I am racing through the streets, out of my mind, thinking I'm leaving one of the most famous chefs in the world. Is 20 minutes late. And when I got there, breathless and soaked and everything else, and he was like, "Okay,
no problem.
What we need to do is we need to have a glass of cold white wine and some oysters. It's the only way this is going to work, Alexander." And I thought, well, that sounds like a great idea. But he, whether it was in his restaurant, but I mean, he explained to me why Lyon is such a great gastronomic city. I spent the whole day with him, and then I finally did go to his restaurant alone. Went there many times. I've not been since he died, but his cooking. I mean, he learned from one of the famous mothers, as they call them in Lyon, the female chefs who really made Lyon one of the world's greatest food cities. And who cooked there in the 20s and 30s, and he worked in the kitchen there and worked his way up. I mean, he'd walk 9 miles every morning to be, there to peel potatoes at 4:30.
I didn't. You had a great quote about. I just wanted to stop you. You were talking about a woman cook, or one chef. You had a couple of times you referred in your book to a quote about women cook for one reason and men for another. Do you remember that?
I do. Part of that quote might not be for general consumption. If you remember, I don't know if you remember it or not, but the thrust of the quote, if you will, was that Mr. Bocuse said, men cook to preen, they cook to show off. Women cook to show love. And he said that's why women will always be better cooks than men. And
that's a great. Well, your whole interview, he was he had a lot of sexual allusions to food and so on throughout the whole interview. But when you did admit to him that you had never wanted to try lobster, and he said you have the right not to like food or to be frightened by a particular food. The important thing is you eventually tried it. What really surprised me, he said, was you like savory foods over sweet ones when you were a child. That's uncommon. And he then produced, just an incredible dinner. And I could almost read these entire descriptions. I mean, he served you the dinner began with a white porcelain soup tureen with a domed cape of flaky dark blonde pastry. When I pierced it with my spoon, the vapor rising from the pool of mink colored soup. Alec, nobody's ever described soup as mink colored. The vapor rising from the pool of mink colored soup, topped with thick matchsticks of black truffle, was so potent with the musk of beef bones and tubers that it made me want to physically wallow in a bath of this liquid for hours. That's what I mean.
I still feel that way, Rudy.
That's what I mean when I introduced Alec Lobrano as a very unusual, passionate, descriptive writer about food, which is very, very difficult to do. His book is called My Place at the Table. The subtitle is, I don't have it on my front page. What is the subtitle, Alex?
The subtitle is A Recipe for a Delicious Life in Paris.
Right.
It is, I describe it, people want to describe it as a memoir, which it is, I suppose.
It is.
Except the memoir sounds very finite to me, and I have every intention of writing many more books. And so I describe it as a coming of age story because I've decided to write the book because it kind of dropped in my lap like a ripe peach. I'd had this amazing gastronomic career of climbing all the way to the top of the mountain when I was working briefly as the food critic for the French equivalent of the Wall Street Journal. And I was writing in French for a French audience, which was a vertiginous experience because it was terrifying, frankly, And when I got one of the best plum food writing jobs in Paris, I knew every morning when I stepped out my door, I'd look both ways because I was waiting for someone to, hit me in the head with a hammer or plunge a knife into my back. It was met with derision and scorn and great jealousy. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. But having done that, where would I go from there? It couldn't possibly to be recognized by the French themselves as someone who was so expert in their cooking that I could judge, they would trust my judgments. I thought, well, I've kind of come full circle here. I've done this thing, and I will always love food, but I also love travel. I love reading, and I love writing. So I thought I'm going to write a book where food and me and food are the main characters. And I'll tell the story of how I made this set, because I get emails every day from people all over the world saying, well, how did you do this? And I say, my father would have said, why did you do this?
Right.
But how did you do this is the question I'm asked. And I say, I said, there was no road. This was just taking a whole bunch of chances when I decided that I would not give up my very good job in New York City as a book editor and strike out into the unknown, first living in London and then eventually ending up in Paris working for Women's Wear Daily. And the most improbable casting in the whole world, me as a menswear critic. I didn't even know who the designers were. I didn't even want to ask anyone in the office what their names were. And the first time that I had to write about them, I went to a shop and I bought a lot of fashion magazines and brought them home and, wrote down names of people who I saw because it was of no interest. It was like learning a foreign language for me. So I think that, there is no way to have a life like this. And the world's changed a great deal because Gourmet magazine is tragically no more. I think we're living in a completely different age. I had the luxury of an extraordinary gastronomic education that, most of the meals that I ate were paid for in the same way that Phyllis Richmond, the Washington Post, paid for her meals. And I think Tom Sietsma, who's the food critic for the Washington Post today, his meals are still paid for. He's a very good writer.
Yes, well. It is. They are. I know him, yes.
But those jobs are becoming rare as hen's teeth because they are very expensive, and there is this ongoing quiet argument in the world about whether or not we're still needed. In an age of democratized opinion, with Yelp and everything on the internet, there is this sort of mano a mano debate going on. Why should Alec Lobrano's opinion be of any more value than mine? I know what I like. No interest to me what he likes. To which I say, actually, Rudy, I mean, if I'm not feeling well, I'll go to see a doctor. I mean, I might have some idea as to what's the matter with me, but I'm not a doctor. I still deeply believe in expertise. I believe in the expertise of a movie critic or a theater critic or a book critic. I mean, the art of criticism is completely different because it's something that's honed and refined and is informed by fairness and deep knowledge. And it's quite different from the idea of having an objective point blank opinion about whether something is good or bad. I'm able to judge whether even something, if I don't like it particularly myself, I can still admire it and explain it to people, even if it's not to my personal taste. I am the vessel for this thing. And given how fast interested America has become by food today, I think this work is really actually very important.
I agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. You talked about not knowing the name of the designers. You didn't know a lot of famous cooking people either. You talk about you went to a butcher in your neighborhood and you were going to get something modest because you were on your modest freelancer salary, I think, at the time. And this large man behind you, and I think he was, he said to the butcher over your shoulder, give him 4 lamb chops, a steak, 4 Italian sausages, too hot and too sweet. Oh, no, this was in New York. I'm sorry. This was at the Jefferson.
This was James Beard when I was living in
but you didn't know it was James Beard at the time. You couldn't figure out who this guy was who was telling him at the Jefferson Market in Manhattan on 6th Avenue to give you this meat. And it turns out to be James Beard. And then you were at Chez George, and you saw a woman eating a red and white radish, and she was dipping it in butter. And I don't know, at some point you realized it was Julia Child, right?
Well, that night, which I just wrote a sort of a reminiscence of that night because I'd been invited to dinner it's the first time that I ever had dinner with other people who thought about food professionally, by the American guy from Oregon who founded the cooking school at the Hotel Ritz in Paris, who was brilliant. His name was Gregory Escher. And he called me and said he'd seen something I'd written about French cheese. And he said, for someone who's not been in Paris for very long, this is really good. Come join us for dinner. And I got there early and was shown to the back of this restaurant. And there was this lady already seated at the table. And I sat down and she, poured me a glass of wine, which was quite welcome. And we started chatting. And it was this sudden, shocking, we've all had moments of, I think, spectacular stupidity in our lives. This was one of mine. When I suddenly thought to myself, Mother of God, this is Julia Child. I cannot believe that it took me this long to catch on to what's going on. Thank God I didn't ask her, so what do you do? At least I stopped there. Right. But we had a very interesting conversation. We actually had a lot to talk about because, as I said in the piece that I did for Airmail News, Graydon Carter's new digital magazine, what we discovered in our slightly brittle chatter was that she cooked, as Paul Bocuse put his finger on, because she wanted to show how much she loved her husband, and also to compensate for the fact that she was almost 6'4". She was a broad-shouldered, lantern-jawed lady,
the big girl,
who thought that her femininity was somehow or another wanting. So there was this was a way of, this was to compensate for not having feminine wiles. And, the more we talked about it, and I thought, well, this is why I'm attracted to food too. I think I've always spoken the language of food because I was very shy when I was little. It was a non-controversial subject, but on the other hand, it was filled with history and sensuality and everything else. It was something I could address that was not controversial or likely to be swatted down. And looking at each other, we had just had this sort of moment of mutual self-recognition when the gang showed up and we had to bury it, but I have massive admiration for her. I mean, she gave us all a huge gift.
Well, you connected with a lot of people instantly. Ruth Reichel, for one, Paul Bocuse, obviously, and some pretty prickly chefs grew to appreciate your appreciation for food. I mentioned James Beard, Julia Child. One of our watchers, has asked if you ever saw Salvador Dali dining at the Hotel Maurice. when you lived
I
there?
know I didn't. I mean, the one of the restaurants in the Middle East is called the Dolly. Actually, the casual dining restaurant is now called the Dolly, and
In the
there's
Maurice? In the Maurice?
in the Middle East,
Huh.
yeah. They turned what was the lobby into a restaurant,
Oh, I didn't know that.
um, and it's called the Dolly. And Philippe Starck's daughter, the French designer's daughter,
Mhm.
painted a canvas ceiling, and there's an image of Salvador Dali with a fishing pole, because what he used to do, they said, was put a lobster on a fish at the end of a fishing line, and hang it out the window and drop it down so that it was hanging in midair in the Rue de Rivoli to see how people would react to it. But no, I never did see Salvador Dali at the Maurice.
I want to expand a little on that Bocuse quote. I don't think this is, I think this is okay to repeat. Women cook to offer love through pleasure. Men preen in the kitchen to impress. And he further told you, this is a Paul Bocuse quote from you, remember the women who cooked for you when you were a child, because you'll never know food so honest and kind. Always let their cooking be your compass. Pretty
It was wonderful advice. I mean, whether it was and on my website, I do a website where I review restaurants regularly. Last year was rather fallow because the restaurants were
no
closed
rest.
most of the time. But so last year I wrote an essay about my mom's food on the website, and it was kind of an in memoriam thing, because her earnestness in the kitchen. The food was good, but it was not Paul Bocuse or Julia Child.
Right.
But it was mom's food, and mom's food for all of us will always be a baseline. Neither of my grandmothers cooked, but they had people who would come to cook for them who were fantastic, and I remember that food too. I mean, Paul Bocuse was an earthy, honest, generous, horny old satyr, who loved wine, women, food,
I
a good time.
I am looking at some of what your conversation with Paul Booth was about, and I probably shouldn't repeat it on here, but he did talk. He really equated food with sex very directly in many ways. Let's leave it at that. You also, this book is not just about food and French restaurants and French cooking and its regions. It woven through it very skillfully and artfully, and one might almost say minimally until the end, is a story of you and growing up and coming to terms with who you were. And you talked about a chef from Alsace named Antoine Schweitzer, who fed to you for the first time, or served to you for the first time, foie gras. And he observed from watching and talking with you, he said, Alex, from what you've told me, I think you've used your love of food to set yourself free. But you always have to go back inside your cage, Alex. You don't have to. And you said you were startled by the intimacy of his observations, as I was by his accuracy, and I avoided his eyes. You came to terms with your sexuality over life, from as a young boy, being probably a little confused, as you might have been forgiven for being, and you came to realize that you were gay, and you also, as you say, were shy. But food has brought you out, hasn't it? I don't mean brought you out of the closet. I mean, has brought you to yourself. And so
Food did deliver me to myself. I mean, I think that it's a language I've always spoken. I mean, if I speak French and English and Italian, my fourth language is food. It's a language that I've always loved, and it was, as I said, a safe. I mean, food for me was a safe place from which to observe the world. And in terms of my being gay too, when I look back on it, since this is Pride Month in the United States, and I've been reading. I mean, in the U.S. press, the Washington Post had a wonderful series of essays about life and different people's evolution. I've been hugely lucky, actually, Rudy. I mean, everyone who has to come to terms with having a sexuality, which is, the world says white and you say black, that's hard. But on the other hand, I also have the advantage of a formidably good education. My parents were supportive of me in general. And so I relativized that. I mean, my search for self-acceptance, which is something that we all do, I mean, when you had the wonderful Jeffrey Weil, the New York-based travel PR, on the other night, and that was such a lovely interview you did with him. And Jeffrey was talking about his search for self-acceptance. We're all of us have a story like that to tell. And I think that by telling them, especially in this world, I think that we're hungry right now, especially, frankly, post-COVID. I think we need storytelling because storytelling connects us.
Always
When
does.
when you read a story and it somehow or another, it gives you goose flesh suddenly because you're recognizing something, or you are moved, or you're thinking, well, that was brave to put that out there. I mean, I will say that when the box of books came to me here in France from Houghton Mifflin, from UPS, and I opened the box and was looking at all these books, and I was thinking, God, well, I sure have put a lot of things out in the world, because it's very theoretical when you're actually writing. I mean,
Right.
for you tonight, I changed out of my habitual, dirty T-shirt into a nice, clean polo shirt. But I think for people who write, it's a very solitary life. I mean, you know this as well. It's what is the art of writing? I mean, when you're sitting there, you're repeating things over and rereading over and over and over. It's very solitary. And so for me, the idea of publishing this book didn't really become real until the actual physical object arrived on my doorstep. And that's when I thought, and yet, on the other hand, the quote that I put at the beginning of the book by that British writer, Jeanette Winterson, and she said, the best stories are always found next to the wound. And when I first read that, I thought this is the most, I mean, that was one of the most brilliant things I've ever read anyone ever saying. And I think to address what you were saying, I think that's very true of my life. I mean, a lot of the things that I might have hidden for a long time, they lost their power when they're put out in the sun, put out in broad daylight. And so I feel right now, I feel hugely lucky in that way, of having completed this great cycle of life, and very keen to begin the next one. The next one being more writing about restaurants, but also more writing in general. I mean, since I have been spending most of the last year and a half down here in the South, I have started a second French life. My first French life was Paris. I've traveled in France extensively, but my living in this little village of 600 people, where when I go to the post office, which is right across the street, is only open for 3 hours in the morning, she looks up and she says to me, "Ah, bonjour, notre Américain," our American. And it never stops moving me, because it's at once, it denotes the difference, but then she says that, you're ours, you are part of our village. And if it doesn't sound insane to say, living down here for the last year and a half, I've fallen in love with France all over again. I mean, I'm learning France from a completely different perspective. It would be sort of like leaving New York City to go and live in Maine, or Chicago to go to Tennessee. France is an absolutely fascinating country. I mean, it's an endlessly fascinating country.
Quick question, then I have a longer question. Quick question. What is your blog? How we found your blog?
The blog is alexanderlobrano.com.
Easy enough.
Right.
What impressed me about your writing, and I know it's not unique to you as a food writer, but you did it very convincingly and impressively, is that, I mean, it was clear you could be very impressed eating at the Maurice Hotel in the Les Ambassadeurs, or whatever it's called, with Christian Constant. Was that the chef?
Yeah.
Is he still there? He couldn't be.
No, he's
okay.
No, and not only that, but this, when you mentioned before about how things are changing in France, and we'll talk about that a little bit, maybe.
Let me before you do that, because I do want to get. The point I was going to make is that you can be as impressed or not impressed eating with at a I know it was a Michelin-starred restaurant at Les Ambassadeurs when he was there, as by a funky something in a not very posh suburb of Paris with a young guy or woman chef who's never heard of. And I think that's impressive. But I think that does lead to what you saw happening during the course of your decades in Paris writing about food. You had Paul Bocuse, who was famous for nouvelle cuisine, things with, foam on top and so on, and very a bit fussy. But then you found a trend starting of younger chefs who were doing what?
Well, what happened after the Gulf War, when the economies in Europe were sort of knocked off course because of the Gulf War. So Christian Constant, who was the chef at Les Ambassadeurs at the Hotel Crillon, 3-star restaurant, there was a whole brigade of really talented guys who were also rugby players. So they all knew each other. They played rugby together, and yet they wanted to go out on their own. They'd had enough of the luxury life. And they decided, Yves Camdibot is the most famous one. He's from Pau in southwestern France. He's the son of a butcher, and his brother still runs the butcher shop. That he would take the skills he learned in luxurious French cooking and apply them to bistro food. But he'd do it his own way. He would serve southwestern French dishes and dress them up with a couple of truffles. Mixing idioms and sort of breaking the rules, and getting rid of butter and dairy completely and using, reduced stocks. The French call it jus, J-U-S, fresh herbs, lemon, offbeat croutons and everything else, like that condiment that we mentioned earlier, the salsa verde, which was, groundbreaking in Paris. You never saw stuff like that. That's still going on. Now we're in the second generation of that. The modern bistro movement, which started in 1994, is now almost 20 years old. And it's what has made Paris I think, better place to eat today than it was when I moved here, because it's added a whole big fat ring of choice to the tree of French gastronomy. And that food in restaurants like Satine, or the restaurant that I wrote up on my blog the other day, a place called Liquide in French, the food was brilliant. It was the dishes like, for example, a trout tartare with freshly shaved horseradish, raspberries, and beet coulis, pureed beets, all mixed together. So it's bright purple when it comes. You're looking at it and thinking, what could that be? And then you remember what you ordered and you taste it. And it's just unbelievably delicious. The constellation of textures and flavors and everything else. Paris is, boiling over with young talent right now. And it's French, but it's also because, ambitious young chefs from all over the world, notably Japan, but also the US, Mexico, Pakistan. People want to come to Paris to learn, to have a French gastronomic education and to cook with French produce. So it's a really exciting time to be here. And the other great thing that's going on now, Rudy, is that Paris never used to be as rich a city in terms of world cuisines as New York or LA or London or whatever. France's colonial past was reflected by North African food and some, Cambodian and Vietnamese and stuff. The only other kitchen the French or Parisians used to take seriously was Italian food, because they do like Italian food, even if they overcook pasta to a degree that is a tragedy. But now, recently, the box has just, opened up, and there's the trend toward African restaurants in Paris, like there's in New York City. One of the most interesting young chefs in Paris right now is a Franco-Malayan. His parents were immigrants to France from Mali, the West African country. He was born in France. He is 6'7". He opened his restaurant right before COVID, slapped him down. He won a Michelin star last year. And his cooking is Franco-Afro-Japanese, because he's French. He grew up eating African food. He said to me when I interviewed him, I've written about him for a couple different people, and his name is Mori Sako, and his restaurant's name is Mosuki. Mosuki was the only black samurai. He was a slave who was captured from Mozambique and ended up in 16th, 17th century Japan. He said, Alec, when I was growing up, going out to dinner was McDonald's. I mean, that was a big treat for us
Wow.
because I'm one of 11 children. So, we didn't go out very often, and I only ate African. And the only gastronomic compass points I had beside my mother's cooking were Burger King and, whatever. But he, with his intrepid curiosity, ended up working in a couple of big kitchens in Paris, and now he's out on his own and won the Michelin star and has a brilliant TV show here, which is a lot of fun because it's called Cuisine Ouverte, Open Kitchen.
Open
Yeah,
kitchen. Right,
Open
right.
Kitchen, which, as you understand, is a pun, and it's poking fun at the idea that this very tall, black skinned,
Basketball player.
right, is going to, stumping around France and explaining France's regional kitchens to the French. And I said to him last time I talked to him, because I really like him, we've become friends. I said, well, do you feel was there something gimmicky about this casting? I mean, how do you feel about this? Do you feel that you're being black, that they were taking advantage of you, or it's a good thing? And he said, no, it's totally cool. It's totally cool with me. I mean, when people eat my food, and he said, the best way, if there are people who are threatened or prejudiced or whatever it is, it goes away when you eat each other's food. So, I want them to come eat my restaurant. I want to show them that I respect French tradition. I want to show them that I'm as French as anybody else is. I was born in this country and grew up here. French is my native language. It's a really exciting time. There's a new inclusiveness in French gastronomy that was not there before.
What is the name of his restaurant? The one star that closed just before COVID. Is it reopened? Is it reopened?
Yes, it has reopened. It's called
Can you spell the name? Can you spell the name?
Mosuke. Mosuke.
Ke. Okay.
And
go ahead, please. Sorry.
If you're headed over this way though this summer, go online and book right away because it's being, he's the getting a huge amount of attention right now, and it's hard to get a table in there, but it's so worth doing. I mean, the food is fascinating, and he does this little tour in the dining room, and I'm so impressed by him. I mean, I just find him, he's so poised and intelligent and charming, and his food's great. And so, yeah, I mean, we've missed Americans. I say that as an American. Paris without the tourists was not Paris. I don't call them tourists, actually. I'd say travelers. We've missed travelers. They're an essential, vital part of the Parisian landscape. And I think most Parisians feel that way. We're really looking forward to seeing people on our streets again from all over the world, because contrary to, what some people, one of the old Saw ideas about Paris is that people aren't friendly. They're not true. Well, not at all. They're absolutely, I mean, if you take, the manners are different. You go into a shop, you say bonjour. When you leave the shop, you say au revoir. I mean, it's more formal. It's more formatted and more formal. Right. But we're really looking forward to having everybody come back and see us this summer.
Well, you're not the only city and a whole lot of continents in the world saying that. If you're curious, you're probably thinking, well, where do I eat, Alex, when I go to Paris? Alex's book, My Place at the Table, which was just published. His last chapter, as I recall, is called My Black Book.
That's right.
And it's one or two paragraph reviews of a number of restaurants that he likes right now in Paris. And they're not necessarily Michelin-starred restaurants, and be careful of those places. I went to L'Estance a year ago or 2 years ago for dinner, and man, the bill was unbelievable. Anyway, he's got restaurants that are not expensive in there. There are restaurants that you may not have heard of or may have heard of. And then obviously I have not looked at Alex's blog, but it's Alec Lobrano. You can see his name typed there.
Alexander Lobrano.
Oh, it's AlexanderLobrano.com.
Yeah, if you feed Lobrano into Google, it'll spit it out.
Okay,
but it's Alexander Lobrano. Yeah,
and he will have suggestions there. Here's a quick question. This is sort of interesting. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but are we overly obsessed these days with avoiding foods allegedly bad for us, as red meat, dairy, high cholesterol foods?
I think everything in moderation, and which is really the French attitude toward things. The French have a completely different relationship with food. I mean, they don't look to it to cure illnesses and to, I mean, Americans are, I mean, there's a flying carpet attitude to what we eat, I mean, I see it sometimes in the US and I think just stop. Um, my advice is everything in moderation and also buy the very best quality that you possibly can. And something else that I feel that's important to insist upon, Marie, is that you don't have to spend a lot of money to eat well. I mean, if you make smart choices and you think through what you're going to do with stuff, you buy seasonal local food. Make meat make meat a once or twice a week thing. I mean, eat a lot of beans, eat a lot of salad, eat a lot of vegetables. Fish, absolutely fish. And that's another one of my favorite things about living in France is the fish, because it's spectacular.
Sure.
Which because in Cap Ferrat, you must be eating a lot of fish and oysters down there.
A lot of oysters in Cap Ferrat,
Right.
where the granddaughters live. Yes. Yeah. In fact, I'm going there in a few days.
Lucky you.
And I'm looking forward to a lot of Cap Ferrat oysters. This, by the way, is not Cap Ferrat, which most Americans, or most people in the world have heard of on the French Riviera, which is very fancy with huge mansions. This is on the other side, on the Atlantic side, below the city of Bordeaux. It's a Cap Ferrat, which is traditionally an oysterman's peninsula, and it still is, although there are a lot of vacation homes there that the French have. Alec, I can't tell you what a joy it was to read your book. I can't tell our viewers how much I recommend it. My Place at the Table by Alec Lobrano. His website is alexanderlobrano.com. It's such a joy talking to you, and I look forward to having a meal with you in Paris sometime.
I look forward to that very much, Rudy. Thank you for having me on, and have a great time with your family in Cap Ferrat.
Thank you so much. Take care, and I will encourage you to come back 2 weeks from now. I think I know who my guest is, but I don't want to talk about it sure because I'm not for sure yet. If you don't get my newsletter, I publish it every 2 weeks. It's sort of gossipy stuff about travel, what countries are opening, what new rules are there, funny stuff that's happened, news you might have missed, ways to earn some more frequent flyer points or some additional hotel points, and sometimes my thoughts on travel too. It's called I Was Just Thinking. It's free. It comes to you in your email every 2 weeks. All you have to do is go to maxatours.com/newsletter. And you can sign up right there, maxatours.com/newsletter. I'd encourage you to do that. And we actually at maxatours.com have put up our 2020 tours. We just posted those this week, so you can see the itineraries and prices if that is of any interest to you. Meanwhile, eat well. I really and read Alec's book. If you're really into, even if you're not really into food, it's a wonderful narrative. You don't have to be a specialist on food to enjoy it. It's a great narrative of the growing up of a man and his education when it comes to food. Meanwhile, take care. See you in a